Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I talk with Dr. Urta Shao about improving gender diversity in leadership by opting out of the default. Dr. Urta Shao, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from Melbourne. It's what, morning for you there, I would imagine? It's late afternoon for me here in south of Salt Lake City in Utah. So I appreciate you with the time difference, your flexibility and willingness to meet. It's a wonderful opportunity to have a nice conversation with you today. We're going to be exploring a recent study that you and your team put out, and on the topic of improving gender diversity in leadership. And I like how it's framed in terms of opting out of the default. And I'll let you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that here in just a moment. As we get started, I wanted to share your bio with everyone. Professor Shao obtained her PhD from George Mason University in 2006. She currently works as a professor at the Department of Economics at Monash University, Australia. Her research interests pertain to the application of experimental methods to understand how incentives and social norms influence economic behavior. Prior to her association at her current university, she worked as an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University. She's also worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. What a tremendous academic pedigree and background, tremendous work that you do. Anything else that you want to share about yourself or anyone from your research team before we launch on into the conversation?
Yeah, sure. So this research that we're going to talk about is a joint work with my colleague Lata at my department, and also Niswan from University of Melbourne.
Excellent.
And we are experimental economists.
Yeah, and that is fantastic. And my background is, I consider myself a scholar practitioner. I'm a professional, or a professor of organizational leadership. And my PhD is in sociology and international political economy. So I do a little bit with the social psychology and behavioral economics stuff myself, and then kind of bring that into an organizational setting. So most of really what you're focusing on in your report, just fits perfectly with the types of interests and framings that I often use in my own research, as well as my teaching and consulting and such. So it's really just a pleasure to be with you. All right. So as we dive on in, I wanted to give you a chance to just talk a little bit about the motivation behind the study. There are so many things out there, in this world of experimental economics, behavioral economics, and all of the tangential related fields. So many things we can focus on. So why this? Why now? Yeah,
well, diversity is a big issue and it remains to be an unsolved problem. And we have seen in the past several decades, more and more women enter the labor force. However, the proportion of women in leadership position remains disappointingly low. To think about that, a precondition for women precondition for increasing the proportion of women in the leadership is probably that we need more women to be willing to participate in the leadership selection process. I have to say that we have made quite a lot of effort. Lots of programs have been set up to train women to be more confident, more ambitious, to be willing to negotiate, so-called lean-in approach. However, those programs so far do not seem to be that much success, individual efforts actually very often lead to backfire. I read an article from New York Times a few years ago talking about an aspiring female professor who tried to negotiate her tenure track position job offer with a university, and she asked for very basic things that we usually ask, such as a higher starting salary, sabbatical, or better maternity leave policy, or reduction in teaching load. And what the response she got from the university eventually is that they decided to withdraw the offer. So she's no longer welcome there. So this shows you that for women to get a a deal as good as men, we just cannot do the same thing as men do, like negotiate like men. And sometimes it can backfire.
Can I just say really quick? I mean, that's a super interesting example. Excuse me. The backfire effect is real in the tightrope that women have to walk when asserting themselves, whether it's in a boardroom setting or negotiating a salary or whatever, right? We could lay out all these different scenarios where where we might say, a woman needs to assert themselves more, but that is so challenging because it's such a tightrope in the societal gendered norms around appropriate and inappropriate behavior and how to go about having those conversations is so challenging. I can only imagine, and I haven't experienced it personally myself. My wife has experienced it, and it's just incredibly frustrating to see that occur. And we want people to be willing to be straightforward, to be clear, direct, and negotiate for themselves. And yet at the same time, when that happens, it has these backfire effects and ultimately hurts the individual, and then it hurts the organization too, because they're being dumb and really weeding out a whole bunch of really great talent.
Exactly. And that's exactly what our study trying to address. So like you said, it's very hard. First of all, it's very hard for women to change those personal traits, to act aggressively, to be able to negotiate with their managers, for example, comfortably. And second of all, even when they tried very hard after all those training programs, learn how to do it, they may not get really the outcome that they expected. So a Harvard professor, Iris Burnett, she has a book called What Works, and nicely said that those training programs simply has very limited success, and individual effort alone often backfires. So what we really need probably to start think about, instead of debiasing individual, instead of changing individuals, maybe we should think more about debiased institutions. And this is how behavior economists can help by taking those research findings that we learned about individual behavior, try to think about whether the institutions are designed to help women, to make women be able to compete and be able to negotiate. So this is what our study kind of motivated by, and we kind of trying to think about how can we debias institutions. And we make a step toward considering how can we debias institution by changing the default in the leadership selection process.
Yeah, and I really like the focus on systems, right? So can we talk about being more effective as individuals, reducing implicit biases as hiring managers, as leaders, helping individuals understand how to assert themselves and be more effective? Can we do those individual level things? Sure, of course we can. But like you said, the research shows that has limited effects. Why? Because all of this is happening within an institution and within existing systems that have negatively impacted certain populations because they were built to support certain individuals in certain types of populations, right? So we need to be able to disrupt those negative systems and to rebuild them in ways that are unbiased. That's easier said than done, but it sure seems like the only way we're going to see any sort of meaningful, lasting change in this direction is to start to do that, right?
Exactly. So I think so far we have done pretty good job in terms of mentoring women. Like in my career, when I start my early career as assistant professor, we attend those economic association kind of conferences. Very often they have all kinds of mentoring program, try to target particular at young female assistant professors or PhD students. And we hear a lot of advice talking about, of course, we work hard, but more they talk about what do you need to do. You need to organize conference, you need to go approach to people, you need to, invite yourself to the seminars, you need to basically negotiate better, you need to act more aggressively, basically. And I often wonder to what extent, how many of us come back and really do those things that, those good advice tells you to do. In my own experience, I always find it's very hard, even though I understand those advices are all good, but to put it into practice, it's just very hard. So we think, okay, maybe we can do something, changing this institution. Of course, it's also a very difficult job. It's very challenging to change institution, especially if it's something that has been taken as a given or taken for granted. This is just how it works, right? So we try to think something simple and easy to implement. And that's how we started to think about it. So we focus on this as we started talking about the default. To give you an example of this, how default matters. So at universities where I worked with, whenever there's an opening, a position for leader type of jobs, very often you got a message, an email from the head or from the university, right? They say, oh, hey, we have this leadership type of positions open now. If you are interested in this job, please email HR, or you can email your department head, depending on what the job is, to express your interest. So this is kind of opt-in type of selection mechanism, right? To express your interest, you have to put your hands up. You have to go to your department head, say, I think I'm so good, and I think I can compete for this job. And I noticed that the outcome is often that many of my male colleagues nominate themselves, and we don't see that female colleagues. Of course, there's also less female economists. We all know there's the gender gap in economics. So of course, there's less female colleagues. So we don't know what is causing the issue, whether it's just because we don't have enough female colleagues to volunteer themselves or to nominate themselves, or it's just this kind of opt-in type of mechanism made it easier for men to raise their hands up, but it's very difficult for women to do so. And I have to confess that I never respond to any of those emails. I never volunteer myself or nominate myself.
It comes back to the backfire effect, right? Because oftentimes women, even if they want to opt in, if they're viewed as overly ambitious, that's seen as a negative trait.
Exactly.
That's a gendered perception, and it's not fair, but that's a common bias that men would have towards a female putting themselves forward, showing that kind of ambition. And so it's one more example of the problem, right? Of this system, this simple mechanism of opting in and of itself becomes a problem and a hindrance to having parity and equity in terms of women in leadership.
Exactly. And also, just to add on what you just said, if we view leadership as kind of stereotype men, masculine type of jobs, we would think that by telling your head that me as a female, I want this job, sounds like go against the norm, right? Because eventually, most leadership type of jobs are taken by men. So for all this reason, and also by this opt-in, basically the default is that you are not considered unless you think yourself is so good, so competitive, and good enough to competing for this job. So you're also acting against the implicit message here to volunteer yourself. And same is true not only for leadership type of position, but also for promotion, for example, right? So in our career, when we want to promote from assistant to associate, from associate to full professor, you have to apply yourself. You have to go to your department head said that, hey, I think I'm qualified for full professor. And we also observe that those call for interest or call for application, very often more male nominate themselves indicate interest for promotion than female. And in fact, I started to apply my apply for promotion to full professor because one day my department head walked into my office and he was telling me that, hey, Ert, I think you're ready for promotion. Would you like to consider to apply this year? And if you think about that, this is actually an opt-out mechanism, because in that conversation, I never felt uncomfortable to say, yes, I want to apply. This is very different, although it's sort of just very subtle difference, but it's very different than if my department simply send an email widely to the whole department saying, anyone who wants to apply for promotion can tell me, right? So this leads us to have this hypothesis, which is this opt-in mechanism in selection might contribute to the gender gap in leadership position. And we are interested in whether we can change this by simply switch to an opt-out mechanism, such that all the candidates who satisfy the basic criteria, or the qualified candidates, would be automatically considered for those positions, either for promotion or for a leadership position. So that's what we want to study in this paper. We just want to test this simple hypothesis. And of course, default effect, we're not the first one who showed this default effect, right? Default effect has been shown powerful in changing behavior in so many domains, such as organ donation and promoting more people to save or taking up insurance. What we want to do in this paper, and we're not aware of that many studies showing this gender difference in the default effect, and we want to apply this to the leadership competition process or selection process. We want to see whether by switching from an opt-in mechanism to opt-out mechanism, this default effect would have a greater impact on women's willingness to participate in the competition for leadership position as compared to men.
Yeah, excellent. And that's a great setup for how the study was designed and what your motivation and your main kind of questions were as you were approaching this. So tell us a little bit about what you found and what your main conclusions were.
I'm excited to announce the publication of my new book from HCI Press, Bluer Than Indigo Leadership: The Journey of Becoming a Truly Remarkable Leader. Early in my adult life, I learned about an Asian proverb that translates as bluer than indigo. If you think about the color indigo, it is a brilliant, deep, and vibrant blue, what some would call the bluest of blues. To have something that is bluer than indigo is rare and truly remarkable. Contrary to popular myth, there is no one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to effective leadership. There's no silver bullet, no secret sauce, no go-to model that will solve all of our problems. The truth is, great leaders have all had their unique strengths and flaws, and have all had to discover and then pave their own distinctive path in their life's journey to fulfill their leadership potential. Bluer Than Indigo Leadership will help you discover your own path and explore those ordinary, everyday actions that will help you respond to an uncertain future and produce extraordinary results for individuals, teams, and organizations.
Yeah, so as I mentioned that we are all experimental economists, we are trying to draw causality that the opt-in mechanism is one of the reasons to lead to the gender gap in leadership. This is, of course, very hard to do in the field because you basically, if you want to know the causality, you need to have basically two institutions that are identical, except one use opt-in mechanism to select leaders and the other use the opt-out mechanisms to select leaders. This is probably not impossible to do that in the field. So what we do is to use experimental methods. We conduct laboratory experiments where we create decision environment that simulate a similar decision environment in the field where people have to consider whether they want to compete for a leadership position. And then we simply just change one variable, which is opt-in or opt-out. So we conduct experiments where participants first just work on some real effort tasks. And then after they finish, we tell them that there's a second part of experiment where we're going to select a leader. Your group, each group will still work on the real effort tasks, but the money will goes to the charity. The job for the leader is simply to make a suggestion to the group how many tasks each of them should work on, and this is non-binding. So the leadership position that we are considered here is sort of like advice given type of leaders. You can think about this as community leaders, or I should say that in our department, for example, also the leaders is often the role is to coordinate, right, to give suggestions to the group what they should do. So it's not really very high power type of leadership, but we do that because we just want to have a very simple environment to draw the inference about the effect of opt-out. And then we create two conditions. In one condition, participants were told that if they want to participate, if they want to compete for the job, they have to select, yes, I want to compete for the leadership position. So they have to explicitly express their desire that they want to compete for the job. In another condition, opt-out condition, we tell them that every group members will be automatically considered for this position based on their previous performance. However, if they wish not to compete, they can opt out. So they can uncheck the box, says, yes, I will compete, and instead select the option that, no, I do not want to compete. So that's it. And then we just look at how many people choose to compete for the leadership position in these two environments. And in particular, of course, we want to see whether there's a gender difference in the participation rates. And what we find is that in the opt-in condition, on average, about 80% men decide to compete for the position, but only 50% women decide to compete for that position. But once we change the framing of the question to opt-out condition, the gender gap almost disappears. So 90% of men compete. So we see this increase of participation for both men and women, but the proportion of women who are willing to compete increased to 80%. And there's no statistical difference between men and women in this condition. So basically we close the gap in the opt-out condition.
Yeah, and that just to reiterate, I mean, that's an incredible shift just by one minor little change, right?
Exactly.
and instead of having an opt-in and having an opt-out, this minor little change made all the difference in the world in closing that gap. And now imagine if one little change like that can make that kind of a difference. Imagine if we start to look holistically and systemically across organizations, all the little policies, practices, procedures that occur that disproportionately privilege men over women. And we start to dismantle those things. All of a sudden, it seems reasonable to think that we could get to the place where we could have gender equity in the workplace. Now that's easier said than done to actually be willing to challenge our assumptions, challenge tradition, and to shift and make those adjustments. But I think sometimes this seems like an impossible task. And what you're demonstrating is it's not impossible. We can do this. Exactly.
So yeah, we'll talk about in practice what might be the challenges later. But let me just highlight another thing, just follow what you just said. One result I found particularly interesting is that we also ask participants to indicate whether they want to compete for the job or not if they know that they're best performer. So that means if they just say, yes, I want to compete, they will for sure win the position. And what we observe is that under the opt-in condition, there is still gender gap, more significantly higher proportion of men say they will participate or they will compete as compared to women. But when we switch to opt-out condition, again, we do not see any gender difference. In fact, we get 90% of participants, both for men and women, decide to participate. So this tells us those training program, right, by just telling women to act aggressively or train to improve their qualification, will still not work that well under the opt-in mechanism. Even if women know that if they're just willing to compete, they will for sure win the competition. Still, there's just something about the women. Maybe it's about this not want to show aggressiveness, not want to show this assertiveness, or not want to show ambitious. This all go against the stereotype of women. Just all this barrier created, we can now remove those barriers by just switching from opt-in to opt-out.
Yeah, excellent. And we're getting close to the end of our time today, but I wanted to give you a chance to share a few of the caveats and the challenges that this poses for organizations, and what organizations might be able to do, practically speaking, to start to implement, utilize this finding to make some changes.
Yeah, so we actually had some conversation with some organizations about doing this. First of all, I think this mechanism works very well if the organization wants to promote their internal candidates to the leadership position, because you can lay out those criteria clearly, and your employees very well. So you kind of know who are qualified, as long as they're willing to put their hands up, who are qualified for those positions. So all what we need to do is simply to identify those candidates based on those minimum criteria, and then simply you send an email or go to talk to your employee, says that we would like or invite them to compete, right? So by inviting, it's also setting up a default that you are considered, you're very welcome to compete as long as you wish to. So I think that can be easily done in some organizations. Now, some type of leadership position, you might also want to consider external candidates. Those are the situation might be a little bit difficult, because sometimes it's very hard to identify who are the external candidates. But if there is such case where if there's some specific type of leadership position where only very limited number of people on the market are available for you to consider, I think that still can be considered. And I think all what we need here is a simple invitation message to the potential candidates that you think they're qualified. And sometimes I'm actually surprised that this has not been considered. Maybe people just have not really think about the default or the implicit message underlying the selection mechanism. Maybe we're all just thinking that the recruiter message is always you send out an advertisement, and then you always assume that as long as people are interested, they would just nominate themselves, they would just submit the application. But if we understand the psychological mechanism underneath that, if we consider the norm behind that, it's probably not as straightforward as we would have thought. So I think it's very important for organizations simply just to think about what is the implicit, what is the default message underneath their selection mechanism. And in fact, our Universities Australia, which is the association of universities in here, they have just recently advertised our opt-out mechanism in their best practice recruitment guidelines as a potential solution to encourage internal candidates to apply for leadership position. And this is not just to reduce the gender gap. I think this in general just increase diversity of the exactly, and not just the gender, but also ethnicity. We want more minority to participate in certain type of job. Maybe we should all think about this difference between opt-in and opt-out mechanism.
Awesome. This has just been a real fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you laying out this study and all of the research behind this. I appreciate the insights that you shared and the practicality of all this, and the reality that this is doable. Like, we can make changes that can erase the gender gap and provide equity and parity, not just for gender, but like you said, really for all different populations, that we can truly have a diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging within our institution, our organization, and drive the value from that. It has been a pleasure talking with you. Before we close, I wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you and your team, find out more about your work, your research, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Yeah, very nice talking to you, and I'm very glad to share this research with you. And I think there's lots of research still need to be conducted in terms of finding out how this mechanism works. And our team are very interested in this gender diversity issues, and we would like to apply those behavior insights into changing the institutions, thinking about how to design the mechanisms. And I would also want to advertise this experimental research as a methodology is a very good way to think about to really understanding the mechanism underneath that. And it's very nice to think about this collaborating with organizations, something you just cannot easily done in organization. You can have a child in the lab and doing some experiment to find out whether certain mechanism would work or not. And our research is exactly for that purpose. We can pre-test some mechanisms, understand it before you really put into the real world to have really real impact. So yeah, very nice talking to you, and I hope more listeners would try to start to think about the message that they're sending when they think about how to design the mechanisms.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I encourage listeners to reach out, get connected, find out more about the research, find out more about the team and the work that's being done in this space. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. The alchemy of truly remarkable leadership. Ordinary, everyday actions that produce extraordinary results. Consider how the nature of work has shifted over the past 50 years. With increased globalization, rapid technological advancement, and the shift in economic composition, the average job of today looks very different than the average job of 50 years ago. What will the jobs and organizations of tomorrow look like? Moreover, what does this all mean for organizational leaders? What are the core competencies and capabilities of organizations and their leadership that are prepared for continued disruption and geopolitical and socioeconomic shifts? Regardless of what the future holds, increasingly, leaders need to be socially minded, data-driven, decisive, champions of talent, and disruptors of the traditional notions of leadership, teams, organizations, and work. The alchemy of truly remarkable leadership will help you to explore your own leadership competencies and capabilities and consider ways to apply and implement them into your workplace and personal life. Check out Human Capital Innovations magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine with the mission to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We publish issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Take a look at the latest issue and let us know what you think. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.